Thank you everyone for joining us today. And we're very fortunate in having an excellent panel tonight or this afternoon. And starting with Wendy Chamberlain, who is a Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament. Before being elected, she served for 12 years as a police officer, and she speaks for the Liberal Democrats on Scotland, Wales, and work and pensions issues, and had previously been our Constitutional Affairs spokesperson. We've also very fortunate to have Clive Lewis, who is a Labour Member of Parliament and a proud campaigner on everything to do with the NHS, living wage, and also, for our purposes, probably the loudest Labour campaigner on PR. So it's a great pleasure to have him here. And I'll be interested to hear what he has to say about Labour picking up the crumbs, from being happy with picking up the crumbs from the table, I think, in terms of coming second. I heard you use that phrase a few months ago. We will be joined shortly by Joanna Cherry, so hopefully staff members have managed to pass her through the contact information, who of course is an SNP, so Scottish National Party Member of Parliament, and is famous for securing confirmation following a protracted court case that the UK had the right to revoke Article 50 and indeed stop Brexit if that is what it chose to do. And she speaks for the SNP on justice and home affairs issues. And finally, we're very fortunate to have Francis Foley, who unfortunately had to step in at short notice for Neil Lawson, who was due to speak, but unfortunately had a sort of family emergency to deal with. But we're very lucky in having Francis joining us. And of course, Compass, as many will know, campaigns on issues to do with a better society, focusing on issues like the basic income, which is perhaps, I hope, a policy that whose day has come. So the format is going to be each of the speakers will have 7 minutes, and we're going to start, as I said, with Clive, and then we're going to be followed by Wendy, and then Joanna and Francis to wrap up. So hopefully that will leave time for questions before our panelists, some of our panelists need to leave. So Clive, over to you. Your 7 minutes starts now.
Thanks, Tom. I shouldn't take up the whole 7 minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm really pleased to be on the panel, particularly one with colleagues from across the various parties, some of whom I've worked with closely for a number of years now. And of course, Francis Foley. I didn't mean as in and Francis, but Francis, you know what I mean. Hopefully you'll get that. I imagine that many of us here today, despite coming from different political parties and movements or traditions, have shared a concern about the state of our democracy. And boy, do we need to be concerned. The theme today is towards a written constitution. And there are, I think, 3 parts to that. The why, the what, and the how. Now, from my perspective, the answer to those questions are, we're in a democratic crisis. The only fitting solution to that crisis is transformation, not tinkering or reform. And we can only bring about real democracy through collective action on a scale that meets the challenges we face. That's what I'm going to focus on today. And that's the broader context in which I see conversations about writing a new constitution fitting in. So let me start by painting a picture of the state of play as I see it, because I think we have to confront the scale of the challenges we face if we're to arrive at the appropriate solutions. Right now, we're standing on a cliff edge. I say that, but when you consider the technological, ecological, and democratic and climate cliff edges that we face, I think we're actually over the edge and clinging on by our fingernails. The pandemic has been devastating. More than 1 million people around the world have died. Millions more have been infected, and many are living with long-term health conditions. Existing inequalities have been entrenched, both domestically and internationally, while public procurement has become a get-rich-quick scheme for cronies. We're also in the midst of an ecological breakdown, which scientists have linked to the emergence of COVID-19. Biodiversity is collapsing, our food chains are collapsing, and many species have been wiped out or are on the brink of extinction. This is made worse by the climate crisis. Even though the cause has been known for decades, there has been an international failure to take the action required because of the mass consumerism and deregulation demanded by free market ideology, which puts profiteering above public good. We're also experiencing the rise of AI and surveillance capitalism, where democracy is seen by big tech corporations as an obstacle to competing with Chinese firms, which benefit from the Chinese state's lax regulation. So why is this a crisis of democracy, you might ask? Well, the root cause of these problems is the failure of established institutions to represent the public, to challenge economic self-interest in favour of a common good. The economic liberalisation over the past 40 years has gone hand in hand with a retreat of democracy and a narrowing of our democratic imagination. Democracy and core democratic values like equality and freedom for all are to be championed at the ballot box, but kept out of the workplace. And this has brought about a new gilded age and the mass accumulation of wealth and power, and that power is increasingly unaccountable. So where do we go from here? The answer to me lies in democratic transformation. I think that's where writing a new constitution for the UK, as well as changing our electoral system, fits in. Let's also be clear, there's nothing about having a codified constitution or a system of PR that guarantees democracy and promotes equality and freedom for all. Yes, writing and codifying a new constitution is a basic requirement for a democracy, but this process, done democratically and harnessing tech for good, is also an opportunity to think about the kind of state we need to meet the challenges we face. What kind of state we want as a vehicle for equality and freedom for all, how we redistribute and decentralise power, and how to remedy the present implications of the UK's colonial past. And yes, proportional representation is the way we realise the basic requirement for fair and equal votes. But we must also see this as an opportunity to renew our political culture, to deepen collaboration, consensus building, and inclusivity, and to make sure that in responding to the challenges we face, those who are systematically excluded, alienated, and discriminated against by our current institutions are put in the driving seat. So how do we bring about democratic transformation in the face of such enormous challenges? I think we need to get out of the 19th century party political silos that aren't fit for the 21st century challenges. That's why I look to the road to 2024 as one that must be paved by electoral pacts and the formation of a strong progressive alliance. For those in my own party, that must mean giving up the aspiration held by some to impose socialism from above and expunge from the party's psyche the need to constantly attempt to re-emulate either 1945 or 1997. Both were unique, but cannot be replicated even if we wanted to. It must also mean moving beyond Labourism and the idea that the Labour Party is the only vehicle for progressive change. For those of a liberal persuasion, that means confronting an instinct to think of democracy in terms of current institutions and representation alone. Any honest analysis needs to acknowledge that the institutions and infrastructure of British and international public life are increasingly dysfunctional and emaciated, that the liberal dream that certain institutions are neutral and beyond politics has long gone, that the checks and balances of liberal democracy need much more than simple recalibration. I'm going to finish by emphasising that I think we need to scale up our ambitions for democratic transformation. Turbocharged capitalism cannot be managed within our eroded institutions, and there is no defence of the status quo that has brought us to planetary-wide climate breakdown. It is simply not plausible or meaningful to impose artificial constraints on our conception of democracy in a way that excludes the economy from our considerations. This is what has led us to where we are right now. Writing a new constitution and changing our electoral system are basic requirements for a democracy. But the scale of the challenges that we face demands that we go beyond process and procedure. We must grasp the crisis as an opportunity for urgently needed transformatory change, and our political culture and institutions that must be underpinned by a radical commitment to freedom and equality for all, which we can then realise through fair and equal votes for all and a new written constitution.
Thank you very much, Clive, and thank you for pointing out and perhaps reminding us all that PR and a codified constitution is absolutely no guarantee of a fair society. It's not the be-all and end-all. It doesn't necessarily deliver what we want, but it's certainly part of the solution. I'm very pleased that we now have Joanna, and I'm sorry for the technical hitches there, Joanna, but now we're going to switch to Wendy. So Wendy, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you to everybody that's on here today. I think the fact that we have an organisation, a grassroots organisation like Unlock Democracy, actually really demonstrates some of the things that we're talking about this afternoon in relation to a written constitution, that there is a recognition that the current system is completely unfit for purpose. And it is something, a written constitution, that the Liberal Democrats have been campaigning for, arguably, for decades. And I think the time has come, and I would agree with Clive, that it's really important that we now act on this. It's become very clear over the last decade in particular that we've got very few checks and balances in our democracy, that it's almost entirely based on norms. And when a government has an 80-seat majority, as is currently the case, those norms can be completely twisted and moved. And we've seen that very much this week. After the Second World War, the Beveridge report talked about reforming the institutions of our state, and I think that there's a compelling case to pursue that social agenda again, with a new focus on climate and potentially the introduction of more progressive forms of welfare support, such as UBI. But one of the things that the Beveridge reforms didn't look at was our democratic institutions. And I do think that post-COVID, as well as given all the other challenges that the UK has been facing over the last decade, is a case for wholesale reform. And that includes the introduction of a written constitution. And I think for the first time, there's beginning to be a real awareness around the UK of the shortcomings of our system, and that it's usually over-centralised, not just in England, but everywhere. And I think one of the other challenges in terms of that unwritten constitution is the fact that what we have seen over the last few years is a real clash between the parliamentary democracy and the direct democracy of referendums, where those have come into conflict with one another. And those norms that I mentioned previously, we just simply don't have a way of dealing with it or understanding. So when you look at countries, and I do agree with Clive, I think there is a link on the overall piece to proportional electoral systems. You would expect me to say that as a Liberal Democrat, but also to more federal systems. And I think there is a case, and I've made this case previously, that potentially more modern democracies with written constitutions, with proportional electoral systems, arguably with more federal systems of government as well, have managed COVID far better than the older systems within the UK and the USA. I fail to understand how somebody being an originalist, as in interpreting the US Constitution the way the Founding Fathers did, is to be a desirable thing in the 21st century. But I do think it's often been the case that the barrier to reform has been perceived to be in England. But I do think that's changing, and COVID is driving some of that change. When we think about the understanding of devolution in the whole, in that Scotland and Wales, from a public health perspective, we're doing different things. But I think nobody can really think about it without thinking about Andy Burnham, Greater Manchester, moralities looking for different ways of doing things that meet the needs of their local communities. And I think this definitely makes the case for showing where power can be closer to people, feeling that their interests are better represented in very tangible things such as track and trace, where arguably a centralised approach during this pandemic has absolutely failed and indeed continues to do so. And I think people are also becoming more aware of the huge power disparities between national governments and the local devolved powers. So for the first time, there is that UK-wide recognition and understanding of the devolved powers. And in England, the idea that it's not just government from Whitehall as the only option, and indeed nor should it be. It's not the right option to deliver what people need. So clearly, there's preconditions for political reform and time of great change and great upheaval, but absolutely no guarantee that that will take place. And I suppose, there is that argument around how do we, for all that it does feel over the last few years that we've been talking about constitutional change on a number of levels, whether that be Scotland's place in the UK or indeed the UK's place in Europe, what is the best way of engaging people meaningfully with constitutional reform and change? Or will potentially people be put off because of the sort of perception of what's happening in the US, for example, and constitutional chicanery? So I do think that we need to think about how we bring forward a package of changes, but that those changes don't move us people away from actually dealing with the day-to-day issues that people are concerned with, that they are seen as things that will add value to our processes and our politics at all levels, as opposed to sucking resources away. We need to ensure that a wholesale constitutional change and a written constitution becomes part of it. I think there are opportunities from new developments such as constitutional conventions, but also in terms of that more deliberative democracy, people getting involved, people wanting to make a change, people like yourselves and organisations like Unlock Democracy as well. We need to use those democratic innovations to ensure that there's democratic consent for any outcome. In terms of practical steps, I'll be really interested to hear thoughts on this in relation to the Q&A. Obviously, people will hopefully be aware of the Constitutional Reform Group that's been led by Lord Salisbury. They're encapsulating the idea of reforming everything in one go. I think there's different ways that you can think and look at that. Potentially, for example, starting with reform of the House of Lords, is that the place where that you would choose to start? But there's no doubt that the bill that Lord Salisbury and the group has set out a variety of various options. And what I would finish by saying is, no matter the future of the UK, it's clear that what we currently have is not fit for purpose. And what we need to do is ensure that people use their voices in order to make that change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. And as you say, I think we have been made painfully aware of the shortcomings of our very over-centralised system in relation to the way that COVID has been tackled in the last 6, 7, 8 months. It's a great pleasure now to invite Joanna, who I'm afraid I made things more traumatic for her by not managing to plug her in at the very beginning of the session, but she's with us and hopefully has recovered from that experience. And Joanna, as I said in my introduction, is famous for many things, but principally for managing to make it very clear that Brexit was something that could be reversed if the UK government chose to do so, or the UK people chose to do so. So Joanna, over to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Tom. I hope you can hear me okay. It's a real pleasure to be asked to do this, and I did manage to join in time to hear all of Clive's contribution and Wendy's, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Francis too. I honestly do believe that the best way to change things in politics and to achieve long-lasting change is to work cross-party. That's how we got devolution in Scotland, and I very much enjoyed working with Tom and others in the last Parliament trying to secure a second vote on Brexit. It's just a shame we didn't manage to do that, and I was sad when Tom lost his seat, but delighted to hear that he's been appointed Director of Unlock Democracy. I think there's so many of the threats to democracy and the rule of law presently faced by the United Kingdom could be prevented if we had a written constitution. The renewed threat to the Human Rights Act, the threat to the right to judicial review of executive action, the more broader threats to the right to hold the executive to power and account to account in Parliament, which started with the prorogation case and we've seen continued as a result of the lack of scrutiny afforded by this government. And also yesterday's outrageous goings on in respect of the independent report into Priti Patel. The threat to judicial independence and the separation of powers. This government now have the United Kingdom Supreme Court in their sights. And also some of the legislation we've seen go through or going through at the moment, the Covert Human Intelligence Services Bill and the Overseas Operations Bill, which are creating new classes of defendants who are essentially above the law. And then, of course, we have the threat to the Good Friday Agreement and the protection of human rights in Northern Ireland, resulting from Part 5 of the Internal Market Bill, and the attack on the devolved settlements, also resulting from the Internal Market Bill. And I think we need to remember that this Conservative government wasn't elected in Scotland, but I'll put that to one side, but it was elected on the back of a manifesto which promised to look at the Constitution, but in a way which would probably alarm most of the people on this meeting. They said that they were going to look at the relationship between government, parliament and the courts. They were going to look at the functioning of the royal prerogative, the role of the Lords, access to justice by ordinary people, and I quote. And they said that they wanted to update the Human Rights Act and administrative law to ensure that there's a proper balance between the rights of individuals, national security and effective government, and that they were going to ensure that judicial review isn't abused to conduct politics by another means or to create needless delays. I think I might be partly responsible for that last sentence having been a bit litigious in the last Parliament, but I do think the case that Tom mentioned and also the prorogation case were important cases and the right decision. And so far of those manifesto promises, we've seen this government start up an independent review of judicial review. They say it's independent, but it's chaired by a man who has said in the past that we should leave the convention, the European Convention on Human Rights, and who says that the Supreme Court got it wrong in the prorogation case. We've got the review of the Human Rights Act pending. They talk about updating the Human Rights Act, but when you try to pin them down on that, it's hard to find out what they mean by that. And of course, this is all happening against a background where one of the major sticking points in the negotiations about our future relationship with the European Union is that the United Kingdom government won't agree to guarantee not to abrogate human rights protections in the UK. And we've also got this ghastly toxic rhetoric coming from the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister and others about lefty and activist lawyers, which interestingly, when we had him before the Joint Committee on Human Rights last week, the Lord Chancellor would not condemn. And this is a Lord Chancellor who, in fairness to him, has been condemnatory of attacks on the judiciary in the past. But I was a bit surprised that he wasn't even more cautiously condemnatory of this anti-democratic and anti-rule of law language. So I'm sorry to sound so bleak, but I do think the constitutional outlook for the United Kingdom is bleak so long as this government continues to be in power. There is some good news. I expect to see a written constitution on these islands within the next decade. The bad news is that not everyone will benefit from it, because I suspect that will come with an independent Scotland. Having said that, if Scotland becomes independent, and if Scotland, or when Scotland becomes independent and when we adopt a written constitution, that could be an event cataclysmic enough to wake up more people in the rest of the UK to the need for constitutional reform. Because whilst I absolutely respect, particularly the Lib Dems who have been consistent in their support for federalism, I respect those who want to see federal reform and a constitutional reform across the United Kingdom, and I am myself, was in the past very much part of the gradualist wing of the independence movement. I fear that, seen from a Scottish left nationalist perspective, the constant talk and promise of federalism never really seems to come to anything. And I think that's why we've seen the movement in the Scottish opinion polls showing now a clear majority in favour of independence and a second referendum. And I think also this is coming about because the consensus in Scotland, and I think indeed across the United Kingdom, the consensus that devolution, the devolution that came to Scotland as a result of the Scotland Act, was a good thing, appears to have been, well, it's broken down in the sense that the government no longer believe that. We know that Boris Johnson says devolution has been a disaster in Scotland. Of course, he's backtracking to say that he means that the SNP are the disaster, not the actual idea of devolution. Now, whatever your view about the political party which I represent, I think most people would accept that there was a very broad consensus supporting devolution when it was introduced after the 1997 referendum in Scotland. 75% of people who voted in that referendum supported devolution, and the scheme of devolution was a very significant scheme dreamt up by the late great Donald Dewar, whereby everything that wasn't expressly reserved would be devolved. And although the United Kingdom remained supreme, United Kingdom Parliament remained supreme, at least in its own eyes, there was a convention that the UK Parliament wouldn't legislate in respect of devolved matters without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. Now, we know that that convention has been overridden on a number of occasions in relation to the Brexit process. And we also know that the Internal Market Bill does undermine that reserved devolved division that was the brainchild of Donald Dewar. And that's not a partisan view, it's a view of many independent experts. For example, Professor Michael Keating has analysed this bill as being a bill that produces, rather than being a power grab, the language which is used in everyday hurly-burly of politics, it's a bill that creates a new principle and a broad cross-cutting powers, which will allow UK ministers to enforce internal market provisions across a whole array of devolved fields that would normally just be the preserve of Holyrood. So Holyrood's not getting any new powers as a result of Brexit, but Westminster is getting sole control over state aid back. There was a dispute as to whether or not that had been devolved. The Internal Market Bill makes it clear it's not devolved, and getting some powers to really override the Scottish Parliament across a whole broad swathe of devolved powers. And it seems to me that what we're seeing with that is a rebalancing of the constitutional settlement embodied by the devolution that took place under the Tony Blair government. I don't think devolution was one of Tony Blair's big mistakes. I think his big mistake was the Iraq War. I think he did some good things, and the Human Rights Act and the devolution are right up there at the top of my list. So I'm seeing it from a Scottish perspective. I'm obviously very focused on the concerns about devolution and the concerns that the lack of recognition for the mandate in Scotland for a second referendum and the movement in the polls, which I think is Trumpian in the way in which the government are trying to resist it. But, you know, for so long as Scotland remains part of the United Kingdom, and indeed even when we leave, I would be very keen to see a fairer settlement across the rest of the UK. I just don't believe it will come without a significant catalyst, and I think that catalyst will be Scottish independence. I share the view of John Major in his speech the other week that what is likely to happen is that Scotland will go first, and that will probably accelerate the process of Irish reunification. I think what's happening in Wales is also interesting as well. So I would hope that that would be a catalyst for reform in what's described as the rest of the UK. Don't want to go over my time, just want to finish really quickly by saying I think it's really right and interesting that both Wendy and Clive picked up on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. And I think the challenge of how we recover from that pandemic and how we build back better, I know it's a terrible cliche, but how we build a different sort of approach to our lives and our economy gives us an opportunity to look at constitutional change that will be transformative in the way that Clive described. And I was reading this morning the report from the Centre for Economic and Social Research and Christian Aid about a rights-based economy. And I think some of the research that's coming about at the moment, a rights-based economy, think tanks like the Commonweal in Scotland on the left who are looking at a Green New Deal and creating a resilient economy. I think the upheaval of the coronavirus pandemic perhaps gives us an opportunity to rethink how we do things in the future. And I'm very attracted by Christian Aid and the CESR's idea of a rights-based economy and human rights as an ecosystem, as they say, of accountability for governments, not just here in the UK, but across the world. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic, Joanna. And so you have predicted that I will be out of a job in 10 years' time because we'll have a written constitution in 10 years' time. But I'm
in
interested,
Scotland.
Interested to hear your espousal of in the past of a federal solution, which is something that people may want to raise, and also that you agree with John Major, but presumably not on his idea of 2 referendums to secure a way forward. But now we are going to ask Frances to speak for Compass, and I hope she's still here. I saw that her.
Yeah, I'm still here. Can you hear
excellent.
me? Okay?
Yes. Yeah. So,
yeah, I was having a
Frances.
few internet problems. Sorry. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Hopefully, it holds together. But this is just the modern world that we live in. So everyone cross everything. But hi. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to come and speak. And really good to hear from all 3 previous panelists about kind of that. Despite the bleakness of the outlook, and I share to some extent the bleakness of that outlook, that there's still also a grassroots movement, still pushing for reform, and also that you need cracks to break to let the light in, and I think there are plenty of cracks, and has happened over the past 5 years. So since I was actually at Unlock Democracy when I worked at Unlock Democracy 5 years ago, I guess, and in some respects the past 5 years have, I think, thrown up a lot more than many people expected to. And, within that tumult, some interesting things come out, and there are opportunities as well as threats within there. So I remain sort of maybe bullishly optimistic. And some of you will maybe heard me say this before, but I am always reminded by this quote of Ferdinand Mount, who said, "Constitutional reform is poetry of the politically impotent." Now, as somebody who's worked for many years now in constitutional reform, I keep that quote well within my mind because it relates to sort of, the first point. And I think it's a point that all three previous panelists have made, which is that we kind of need power before we can make strides on this, before we can actually make progress, and before I think we will see a written constitution. So I think the very first thing that I wanted to say straight off the bat is, coming back to work at Compass, having worked at a number of different democratic organisations, our focus now is on a progressive alliance, because as Clive said, without a progressive government, that impetus for reform or that opportunity or space for reform is extremely narrow, and I would say almost non-existent. And I mean, that's the sort of the paradox that we're sort of starting with, which is that the problem is at the centre, but we need the centre to be to a certain extent on side in order to open up that space for us to be able to work within. So today, I actually, unlike the other panelists, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the how, and that is simply because over the course of last year, 2019, I was involved in a project which looked specifically at how you would design and deliver a citizens' convention on UK democracy. So it was a project that was funded specifically just to look at the dynamics of that, the logistics of that, and was quite a design challenge for those of us who've been involved in deliberative democracy, but also constitutional reform. So it was a bit of a marriage of my kind of two interests up to now. And where I wanted to start with that is just to talk briefly about how the four different parts of what I would say the coalition that is needed for that to happen play their role. So I see that as four different parts. The first part is the UK government, the central UK government. The second part are the citizens who are sorted by sortition and selected to be part of this process. I'll say more on that in a second. The third part is civil society. And the fourth part is the general public. So some of you also might be thinking that, okay, we have got a Tory government who's, as Joanna said, that has at least professed an interest in some sort of reform, but like Joanna, I share the cynicism and perhaps not cynicism, but at least skepticism about what the Tory government are planning with that. And in fact, the Commission on Constitution, Human Rights and Democracy has, in its early days, come out with some things which perhaps, whilst not alarming, are certainly concerning in some direction. And I'm very, very much not hopeful about the prospects for them to bring about the sort of radical change that Clive was talking about, or that I think that we need. So we do need a progressive government, I would argue, in the UK to kick off this process. And actually, that was why we decided last year to focus on the UK government. We focused on it because we said we have a bit of an irony, which is that in order to share power more equally through different parts of the UK, and in order to democratise and modernise our political system, we need to start with the permission of the UK government. So that's obviously the tricky one, really. And I've always put it as we need to bite the hand, but after it feeds us. So we need the UK government to unlock this process, unlock democracy, and allow us to bring this process a sense of radicalism, a sense of ambition, a sense of aspiration, and a sense of reality, a bit of a reality check about where we are, as Clive spoke to. The reality of this crisis is that it's going very deep, but people can easily not see it as such because they see it as a crisis to do with the economy, or to do with a bad government, or to do with, if we just change those folks at the top, everything would be different. I don't need to persuade many of you here in this room today that actually a lot of the problems are much deeper than that and lie within our constitutional system. So we need to start there. And part of the reason we need to start there is because politicians need to, whilst many of us have sympathy for the view that we kind of need to come for politicians and that this change will happen to them to a certain extent rather than with them, we need enough of them on side. And I think three are, really good advocates for this in the room already today. And there are many more, to be fair. We need them to think this is not about the individual politicians and getting rid of them. It's about saying, let's redesign our representative system so that it is A, more representative, and B, more open to different kinds of democracy rather than just representation. Deliberative democracy that we've heard, even direct democracy, I think there is a place for that, but it needs to be carefully managed. And you can see examples of this around the world. So for example, in Ireland, which many of you will be aware of, the real focus of that was getting the Irish government on side with the first Irish Assembly. Was really about bringing the politicians into the room to say, there's nothing to be afraid of. This is an experience you're all going to get something from and feel enriched by, and you have a role here. This is really important. So the second part are the citizens, who I would argue need to be randomly selected. And part of that is that people feel these are people who are just like me. It could have been me, the sort of national lottery, it could have been you moment. And I think that's quite powerful for people. So it could also be that people are worried by that and scared by that, but I'll speak about this more in a second, but that's where the educative part of this comes in. And it's really an opportunity for us to have a big political education process in this country. But when it does work, I think what it doesn't just do is provide some outputs or decisions. It also really firms up, and I would say deepens and reinforces democratic faith in this country. And by democratic faith, I don't just mean faith in democratic institutions and in our system. I mean faith in one another, which is basically where this starts. That may sound quite idealistic, but I think that the whole process of Brexit, and even to a certain extent, the Scottish independent referendum, as you know, it's been brutal for lots of people. People being on different sides of that binary has been tortuous for some families and friends and relationships. And actually what we need to do is shore up that faith in one another, in our good faith, in our capacity, in our abilities to learn and come to good decisions. So thirdly, civil society. I don't need to say too much about this because I feel like you're all participating in an organisation who's, you know, really pioneering on this front in terms of supporting a written constitution and this kind of process. But civil society also needs to be careful that it's not about getting the outcome that we want. Many of us are in favour of a PR and a written constitution, but it's also about saying we trust the people to come to good decisions on this. There's a great little anecdote that I always tell about the Irish Citizen Assembly process where they actually changed the menu. They changed the way that you decided your menu each day. And each day they had a different voting system. So one day it was first past the post, one day it was a STV, one day it was alternative vote. They're different kinds. And through that process, the members of the assembly had the direct experience of seeing some of their choices. Oh, the chocolate pudding beat the rice pudding. That wasn't what I voted for. And I thought it was just a really inventive way of helping people engage with this issue a lot more. Very finally, the public. So the first stage of our process, and I'm going to drop a link in the chat after this you can read the whole design process. Some of you might have seen it already, Citizens Convention on UK Democracy. But the public are the really crucial part of this. Otherwise, it just remains within a very narrow space. So many of you will know about examples like Iceland, the first famously crowdsourced constitution, but really also media organizations like the BBC, Channel 4, different newspapers as well. Print media has a huge role to play in this in terms of upping the legitimacy, making people aware, dispelling myths, and helping people feel part of this process. So the first 8 months of this process we foresee to be just some big kind of quite lively, messy, dynamic national conversation about democracy, and that's to get people on board, understand this is happening and that it's not happening in a smoke-filled room. So the very final thing I wanted to say is that I think all of these 4 pieces, the public, civil society, the citizens themselves who are selected, and the UK government have a role to play. And also that if we push towards this process and all of those pieces tessellate and come together, that it could be a very powerful thing. The question is, how do we unlock this process? And that's where I go back to, we need a progressive alliance. That's why I'm at Compass. We're working on a progressive alliance, and watch this space.
Thank you very much. Fantastic, Francis, and for sort of setting out the 4 different partners who need to be engaged in this process for it to be effective, but also reminding us something we haven't discussed yet, which is the government's Commission on Constitution, Democracy and Rights, the remit for which seems to be, frankly, anything about constitution, democracy and rights, but much more about taking those rights away from us. Now, we have a large number of questions, and I think for the purposes of trying to get through as many of them as possible, I'm afraid I'm going to read them out rather than go to individuals. And I may take Clive first because he said he was going to have to run for a train, I think, in the next few minutes. The first question was, the argument is that PR gives us coalitions and stability, as has been the case in most of Europe. However, what we are starting to see, certainly in European countries, some of which practice PR, that actually it's not necessarily providing the stability and democratic accountability that we might expect to come from those systems. So, Clive, what would be your response to that?
I think the first thing is history. And I think when you look at both Hungary and Poland, they haven't got a long history of parliamentary democracy in those countries. Also, as well, the institutions that they have are relatively new, unlike perhaps in the United Kingdom, where they have taken a battering over the last 40 or so years, but nonetheless, they have been very well established. So any erosion is going to take longer and have less of an impact in that period of time than perhaps it would in Poland or Hungary. I think there's also the issue of a very complicated relationship with the European Union. There are different political cultures as well. But I think the bottom line is, democracy is about constant vigilance. Just because we look at the US, it has a written constitution. Do I want a US style? Do I want the same problems that the United States has? No, I don't. PR is the same. These aren't silver bullets, but I think taken in tandem with those new institutions, with the radical renewal that we can get from this approach that we're talking about today, I think it can be the start of something which will not be a permanent fix. Who knows what will be required in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time. But I think here in the UK, we can seek to not perfect, but to improve our democracy. Every country will be different. There is no one size fits all. And I think that's quite clear in the way that both Hungary, Poland, and let's be quite honest, the United States and the United Kingdom are faring in this part of the 21st century. There is a real crisis of democracy, and it isn't just in those countries. I would argue in a different form, it's here as well, and definitely in the United States.
Okay, thank you, Clive. Would any of our other panelists like to come in? Wendy?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Clive said, and I think the other bit for me is definitely around culture. So we've touched on there some of the European countries where democracy seems to be faring less well, but I think a really good example to look for in terms of the journey potentially the UK is on is New Zealand, in that had a first past the post system, moved to PR in the 90s, and has seen a Labour government elected to a majority for the first time. But I think what's been very interesting about that is the Labour Party have not chosen to govern as a majority government.
Yeah.
They have still brought people into their administration because culturally the country is comfortable with the fact that parties work together and that no one party has all the answers.
Yeah.
Joanna, were you indicating? Need to unmute yourself.
Sorry to be the bore who forgets to unmute. I agree with a lot of what's been said already. I feel very strongly that although PR is not a silver bullet, it's the right thing to do because it results in better representation in Parliament of what people have actually voted for, fairer vote share for small parties. For example, in Scotland, I mean, I wouldn't say that the system of PR for the Scottish Parliament is at all perfect, but it has resulted in the rise of the Greens in Scotland. Again, it was a system that was designed that no party could really hold an outright power, and that has happened only on one occasion. So I think, despite the fact that it hasn't prevented the rise of populism in some countries, doesn't mean to say that it's not the right thing to do. It for me, it's fundamentally the right way to go because it's proportional and it results in fairer representation and stops the sort of crazy huge majorities we see at Westminster on the back of not really such a big lead over the other parties.
Thank you. Francis, you were nodding in agreement. Did you want to add?
Yeah, I'll add one quick thing just to agree with everybody that they've been said. But I think also what's important is here at Compass, we're obviously thinking a lot strategically about how we approach getting PR, and we see the only route at the moment to be through Progressive Alliance. And the point of the Progressive Alliance is not just to get a progressive majority government, but it's also to show beforehand, to demonstrate the possibilities that PR would unlock, which is more collaborative working, genuinely respectful, but also other alliances which hold people to account. People always say to me, well, why doesn't the Greens just amalgamate into Labour? And I've just said, well, you've totally missed the point of an alliance. Like an alliance is, they are separate, but you create an alliance which makes you both stronger and holds you both to account. It's a combinational style of politics, which requires parties to have a clear sense of identity, but also a clear commitment to collaborative working because you understand the validity of other political philosophies and also the sort of dynamism and interest which comes when those philosophies intersect and interact. So I would say it's a lot about giving people the experience and saying, hey, look, you can see us doing it. We can actually, believe it or not, work together. And that actually requires, unfortunately, a lot of leading politicians, many of them on the call tonight, to show that in action in the bones of the current system, which massively disincentivizes it, right? So it's really just a clarion call to all progressive politicians to say, any chance you get a chance that is, you know, authentic to make that collaboration seem real and effective, please take it, because the public are desperate to see it.
Tom, can I just come in very quickly,
Sure,
just to
Wendy.
say that, you know, PR is not just about progressive politics. The Brexit Party have signed up to Make Votes Matter, you know, fairer systems pledge, because the reality is the Brexit Party's biggest impact in the general election last year was when it chose to deprive a majority of its voters the opportunity to vote for it in Conservative held seats.
Thank you, Wendy. Now, the next question I've got is very definitely for Joanna. Because the question is, will a written constitution explicitly state that the country will be a republic or a monarchy? Joanna, you were referring to the written constitution you're going to have in 10 years' time. Well, will it be a republic or a monarchy?
What I actually said was I felt Scotland would have a written constitution in 10 years' time. I'm not so optimistic about our UK, but I think change in Scotland could be a catalyst for change in the rest of UK. Well, I mean, that will be up to the voters. I mean, at the moment, my party's policy is for constitutional monarchy. My personal view is I'd like to see a republic in Scotland, and I think that's a view that's widely held in my party now. And I think if we ever get round to debating this issue again at a conference, I suspect the SNP will change its policy. Not very high on my list of priorities, but I suppose I see a commitment to a constitutional republicanism. For me, they go hand in hand, because I think constitutional monarchy is rather outdated. And I think, you know, we see tensions and problems, as we saw last year with the prorogation, and tensions and problems as we saw in 2014 with the Queen's intervention in the independence referendum, almost unprecedented. So there are tensions there. I'll be frank, I think while the current Queen continues to reign, most people don't have much appetite to argue vigorously for a republic. When the current Queen is no longer the current Queen, then I think that will be, again, a catalyst for a move towards a republic, at least in Scotland. I think the current Queen is widely respected by people like myself who see themselves as being pro-republic, but respect the current Queen.
Clive, you were doing a lot of nodding.
I agree. I mean, obviously, I would love to see the day that that England became a republic. But obviously, I agree with that. I agree that that's probably some way off. Look, I'm going to have to go now. It's a real shame, because I did want to take part in this debate. If I could just finish very quickly, Tom, and say, I think that so much of this is going to be academic without the bulk of the Labour Party getting behind this. All I can say is that the campaign to get PR as a policy in our party is on the move. I think it's never been stronger. I also think that the state that the Labour Party is in at the moment, a question that I think needs to constantly be asked of Labour MPs, Labour members, is, do you genuinely think, and let's see where we are after the Scottish elections, I think it'll be an even worse situation for Labour in terms of route back to power. Do you think that you can achieve 124 seat gains for a majority of one by 2024? And I'm sorry, but the answer is no, we can't. And I think I think we as a party are in denial about the reality, because if we don't accept that that is the case, then someone show me the route map to victory in 2024. It doesn't make a difference how brilliant Keir Starmer is, how brilliant our policies are or not. I just cannot see how we would be doing that in 3 years' time. That's the first thing. And secondly, unless you're talking about allowing the Tories to have 15 years in power, which no one at the moment is conceding, the answer has to be, show me a strategy that gets the Tories out. And there is only one strategy that I can see. And until my party accepts that, they are basically handing the Tories another 5 years. And we haven't got time. The climate crisis and all the other cliff edges I mentioned mean that we do not have the time for that. So I think my party has got to be pushed on this issue, because the answer, they know what the answer is. You speak to most Labour MPs on the choir and they agree with me. They just will not say it in public, and they need to be made to tell us the route map to that victory in 2024 with that final heave, that final push that they seem to be saying in public, which in private, I know they know is literally impossible.
Thank you very much, Clive, and thank you for staying with us for as long as that, and good luck with catching your train. Not that I thought anyone caught trains anymore, but good luck with catching it. Thank you very much. Wendy, did you want to come in on the vexed question of whether a written constitution should include a monarchy or a republic?
To be honest, I think I was largely in agreement with Joanna from a perspective of, I think while the current Queen remains Queen, it's not a debate that anybody wants to have. And I suppose for me, it is around how do we get people engaged productively with constitutional change? Because obviously what's happened over the last 5 years doesn't feel like it's been, and beyond that, doesn't feel like a positive experience for many. And noted Francis was obviously talking about, you know, the real divisions. My husband, who always seems to come in with a cup of tea when I'm actually speaking on these kind of things. I think he waits outside the door. It's very good of him to bring me a cup of tea though. It's quite common knowledge that he's a member of the SNP, and how we work through that is the fact that we recognise that actually we want many of the same things. We just have a different view about how best to get there and how best to achieve that. And I think part of the issue around constitutional reform, or the appetite for constitutional reform, is really is really driven by some of that real negativity around what has happened over the last few years, and the real division and rancour that exists and continues to exist. So to be honest, I'm fairly agnostic. I don't have strong feelings either way. I'm watching The Crown, like I'm sure a lot of people are over the last week, but I don't think it's a debate necessarily for now.
Thank you, Wendy. Francis, I don't know whether you wanted to, you know, whether
I've got too much to add. I'm personally like Republican, but and I try to avoid anything to do with the royalty, because I think their saturation of popular culture helps keep them alive. Not that it's not interesting or good, right? But like I'm like, no, enough of the royalty stuff. So I do try to, you know, The Guardian had a great thing when the royal baby happened of like, if you're a Republican, click here, and you could just not see any of the coverage. And I'm like, to be honest, one of those.
But just sort of seriously for 1 minute, in relation to the discussions that you have with members of the public, have you picked up on whether something like, you know, written constitution, which actually was for a republic as opposed to a monarchy, whether that's something that the public would have a very different view on, whether they supported a written constitution, for instance, or not?
Well, I agree with Joanna that a large part of people don't. My experience is that people are thinking about this through the lens of the current Queen, which, let's face it, for most of us has been like our whole lives, and that personhood and which is why I say, you know, it was flippant, but actually their role in popular culture is sort of eclipses the constitutional question. I think a lot of people, you know, very understandably, because somebody else made a point in the chat about political education, which I could not hammer home enough about, you know, people just basically not knowing that the Queen functions as the head of state, and actually that's why she's still here, and that's why she's constitutionally important. I think that comes first, but what I would see the Citizens Convention as doing is popularizing that knowledge and giving an opportunity for people to hang on, wait, A, we don't have a written constitution. You know, a lot of people just genuinely don't know that. And B, the Queen is a head of state. Oh, that means this and this and this. And, you know, the implications of that, I think, need to be drawn down, because our system is notoriously complicated and incremental and a hodgepodge of loads of different traditions. And in fact, the Citizens Convention is a vehicle thinly disguised to educate the whole populace about the constitutional system we live under. So I was sort of agnostic about the idea that a convention might come up with this or that solution to this, but I think it'd be a really good thing to just have that conversation.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Francis. A question about a federal UK, which of course is what something that Joanna referred to earlier. So should we be moving to a federal structure whereby each level of government has rights and responsibilities that cannot be overwritten by higher levels of government? I suspect I know what Joanna's answer is going to be, but Joanna, perhaps I'll take you first.
Yeah, I mean, I would much prefer federalism to devolution, because if we had a federal structure in the United Kingdom, then what is happening under the Internal Market Bill, what is being done to the powers and competences of the devolved parliament couldn't happen. It certainly couldn't happen just as a result of a government with a large majority. And I think, federalism works very well, for example, in Canada. During the CETA negotiations, the provincial governments were in the negotiating room. The federal government listened to the provincial government, their concerns about trade. In Canada, although immigration is a centralized power, there are many, the way in which immigration policy is delivered varies hugely from province to province. And, clearly these are things which don't seem to be feasible in the United Kingdom under the current settlement. So I have no opposition to federalism. Clearly what I want in the long run is, and actually I think in the short term it is coming, is an independent Scotland. My problem with the current chat of federalism is this. I absolutely agree with what Andy Burnham said last week, that he was concerned about Boris Johnson's comments about devolution and that we live in a very London-centric country, which is why it's a divided country. But I have no confidence that federalism is anywhere near being delivered in this country. And I base that lack of confidence on the evidence of recent years, the promises of Gordon Brown and others that if people voted no in Scotland in 2014, we would have something as close to federalism as you could imagine. That has simply not been delivered. And for reasons that Clive very clearly articulated, I don't see it being delivered from Westminster in the current next decade. And I see in the chat that some people think that Scottish independence shouldn't be coming into this conversation. But the reality is, I've been asked to speak today. I'm an SNP MP, but more so than that, the reality is that the debate in Scotland has moved on. A whole series of opinion polls show that the majority of people in Scotland want an independent Scotland now, and the majority want another referendum, not necessarily straight away. We're in the middle of a pandemic still. And I actually don't think there'll be one next year either, despite the fact that some of my senior colleagues have said that there should be. But I think there will be one soon. And I think that movement in that direction of travel is irreversible. And I say that because I see it amongst my constituents and also my friends, those who were very firmly no in 2014, moving to yes or moving to being open to be convinced towards yes. So I have no downer on federalism, but I think federalism is normally imposed within a cohesive state. I wouldn't say that the UK is a particularly cohesive state at the moment. And, the United Kingdom is not Spain. The United Kingdom is based on the union of two separate nations, a nation that was a state previously. So there is huge legitimacy to the desire for self-determination in Scotland. And even for those who do not like it and don't want to see it and would like the UK to stay together, I simply say, recognise the democratic direction of travel in Scotland. It's pretty clear.
Thank you, Joanna. Now, Francis, I know that you've got to go in the next few minutes. Did you want to respond to that?
Only just to say that I'm quite a big fan of federalism, both because I'm a Mancunian by birth, but also because I spent a long time in Germany, and so obviously also have PR and a federal system. And I respect the points that Joanna just made about it being a different setup, and historically, obviously, Germany was this kind of actually just mini states which sort of came together. But I think what I'm interested in that is just this question of how power can be meaningful at the local level. And once again, I go back to this point about experience, which is just giving people the chance to experience it. And I would argue that's also to a certain extent what's happened in Scotland. And I agree with Joanna, that's kind of strengthened the hand of independence in the sense of having this government which is, looking out for 5 million people rather than 65, and trying to say, okay, well, what is in their interest? How can we link this to, the principle of subsidiarity, which is just the sort of cascading down of power from this level, to the lowest appropriate level. I think the possibilities for that in terms of actually genuine democratic renewal are huge. And I'll just make one final point, which is that, I think if you look at government as being a system of government as being this constant balance between legitimacy and effectiveness, I think the problem with our current system is that it is neither, right? And increasingly people are understanding this. They're understanding that our system is illegitimate because of the first past the post system, and because of the falling turnouts, and also because of this weird kind of concoction we have of then deliberative democracy, like sort of happening at the council level, but then direct democracy and referendum, and then actually sitting within it all, like this toad squatting in Westminster is just this old, really archaic representative government, which is like no longer representing people, right? And then you've got the King of the North up there saying, well, hang on, why are we not getting access to, it's all falling to bits. And then you've got the effectiveness question, and people are really seeing that now in COVID, right? They're seeing this is just not an effective way to run the government. The best thing I heard, actually the best advocate for democratic reform and devolution I heard recently on the radio was an epidemiologist who was saying, look, actually, you should treat this as a series of small epidemics rather than just one national approach as a pandemic. They're doing it. They did it the first time in Germany. Germany are not doing so well now, unfortunately, much to the consternation of my German friends and family. But they're much better, the first time, because they outsourced it all to the federal states. And the federal states treated it as a localized epidemic and really knew their patch, as Andy Burnham and his colleagues do in Manchester, and said, we collect the data, we'll do something about it. So, I feel very passionately about this issue of people experiencing that. And, my final point will be, if we were pushing for that kind of thing, then a constitutional convention would allow that, because you can't do it piecemeal. You have to do it wholesale.
Great. Thank you, Francis. And thank you for stepping in at the last minute. And if you need to leave, we'll understand why.
Thanks so much for having me. Really nice to be back at Unlocked Democracy and see some familiar faces. Sure. See you guys soon.
Thanks, Francis. Wendy, would you like to come in on this question?
Thank you, Tom. And very conscious that I'm here as a Liberal Democrat, but I'm also a Scottish MP as well. And I don't want to get overly political, but I do concur with some elements of what Joanna has said from the perspective of, I think there were fundamental errors in terms of devolution in Scotland and then in Wales, but no change within the rest of the UK, namely England. So as a result, I think there's been an increasing democratic deficit in England, but also a lack of understanding of what devolution is that has only been brought into stark focus, arguably, in the last year. So I can understand absolutely why we're seeing some of the direction of travel potentially that we've seen. But it's also to say that within Scotland, there's probably been parts of Scotland, you'll have seen it in terms of Shetland, etc., looking for an increased level of devolution from Holyrood as well, arguably, from Westminster. I think the other thing that we have to absolutely acknowledge is the fact that in terms of people's views in relation to independence has been people's increasing move to see how they view independence from the position of our departure from the EU. In 2014, I would argue that vast majority of people did not think about how they felt about Scottish independence in relation to how they felt about the EU, but that absolutely in the years since, and increasingly between the referendum in 16 and 19, that's absolutely how it's been seen in terms of that prioritisation potentially of identities. And I suppose that's where Joanna and I differ, because I don't have, maybe that prioritisation of identities isn't something that I necessarily do, but I respect those that do. I suppose where I am coming from is I wouldn't see myself as a unionist. It's something I feel quite uncomfortable out using it as a term. I would definitely say that I'm a federalist, and that's one of the reasons why I'm a Liberal Democrat. And I suppose in terms of the future of the UK, or the future of the British Isles, maybe is the way to look at it, that geography, just the same as geography was the case in terms of the European Union, there will continue to be ties across these islands, whether they're cultural or economic, regardless of what the future of the UK as a whole might be. And I suppose what I would continue to argue is the rest of the UK, should Scotland leave, the UK will always be an elephant that Scotland will be in bed with. And so my argument would be that better that we were one whole in order to manage those things rather than separate. But federalism, yes, I would appreciate that this is we're on a direction of travel at the moment. Constitutional change is becoming more and more necessary, but potentially we don't currently have the government that will recognise that.
Thank you, Wendy, for leaving us with that image of elephants in bed. Now, this is a question which might better have been addressed perhaps by Francis, who's now left, or indeed could be a question perhaps directed at me as the director of Unlocked Democracy. And that is, how do you propose framing issues of constitutional change to recognise that for many people, this sort of political issue is quite dull? Wendy or Joanna, who would like to try and jazz up constitutional change? Wendy.
This just makes me think of a quote, and I was just actually having a frantic look there on my Facebook page that I'm sure I shared a number of years ago, and I think I shared it again this year, which was that whole bit of people tell me they're not interested in politics, and what that means is you're not interested in education, you're not interested in street cleaning, you're not interested in
constitutional change shouldn't be dull to anybody.
Yeah,
sorry, Mike.
It involves our rights and that sort of.
No, I entirely agree, Mike. So I suppose the point I'm making is politics is part of everyday life, whether that is who takes your bins out over to what our future relationship with the EU is. So if you're not interested in politics, I suppose it suggests that you're not fully engaged. So clearly, I think the last decade has demonstrated that constitutional reform or constitutional change is far from dull, and it has swallowed up a great deal of the day-to-day politics, so much so that arguably the things that people really care about, those key issues, education, etc., haven't been given the attention that they deserve.
I got muted there. What I was saying is we're not supposed to be a political organisation, and that if people realise they've got rights, then they probably will be quite excited.
Okay, thank you.
Joanna, would you like to come in on this question? How do we make constitutional change relevant to people?
Yeah, I mean, I think possibly, I think whether we like it or not, it's not very pleasant for myself or Wendy or Clive. Politicians aren't terribly popular, and many members of the public hold politicians in quite low esteem. But all I can think of is my experience and what brought me. I've been a sort of sleeping member of the SNP for almost a decade before the independence referendum. What brought me into politics was that independence referendum, and the phenomenon that occurred there, certainly on the yes side, was many grassroots organizations growing up, genuine grassroots, not set up by the SNP or even the official Yes campaign, but growing up. I mean, I led a group called Lawyers for Yes, which was genuinely set up completely separately of the official Yes movement or the SNP as a grassroots group. And so far as you could ever describe lawyers as grassroots, there was NHS for Yes, but there were all sorts of other groups. And many of these groups have continued to exist in Scotland. Many of them morphed into fighting against Brexit, and some of them have now morphed back into very much focusing on independence. Others have focused on issues like land reform, and what Wendy very rightly identifies as an issue in Scotland, which is we need more decentralisation. Local government in Scotland, a friend and colleague of mine in the Yes movement, Leslie Riddick, has written widely about this, about how poorly our system, our attitude towards management of land and also our local government systems compare to the Scandic countries. And so, I think what I'm trying to say is that constitutional change can enthuse people, but it needs to be, it seems to do that when the grassroots become enthused, and when people, I hate to use the phrase ordinary people, particularly as there's some man who sends you a postcard every time you say ordinary people if you're a politician, but people who aren't members of political parties but care about rights issues and care about the issues that affect their communities become involved, seeing constitutional change as a vehicle for the realization of the other things that they're passionate about, like land reform, like decentralization, like better local government, like a resilient economy, like a Green New Deal. So I think that's how people become interested, when they start to see constitutional change as a vehicle for real and meaningful change that hasn't been delivered by the official political parties.
Thank you very much, Joanna. And hopefully we've just got time for one more question. And that is, if we secure a written constitution, who do you think should be in charge of making sure that the constitution is regularly updated when appropriate? Joanna, would you like to lead off on that?
Oh, that's a really difficult question. It depends what you mean by updated. I suppose we talked about America a bit earlier. one of the reasons that the Supreme Court and the appointment of judges towards the Supreme Court has become so massively politically controversial and important in America is because it's the Supreme Court that updates the Constitution. You know, okay, Parliament or Congress and Senate can amend it from time to time, but the Supreme Court has been very influential in updating a centuries-old Constitution to deal with modern concepts, you know, cases like Roe against Wade. I would not like to see that a Supreme Court in the model of the American style. I don't like it. I think it's become too politicized. I think, and again, I do think about it very much from a Scottish prism. I think it's really important to have proper checks and balances. When Scotland becomes an independent nation, I would like to see a bicameral chamber and a constitutional court. And I think also you have to have some rules that the Constitution can't just be updated or amended in the same way as you would pass a bill. There has to be some supermajority, or in Ireland, as they have to have constant referenda, although I think everyone in the United Kingdom and Scotland is going to be a bit sick of referenda by the time we get round to having a written constitution. So I suspect that won't be a terribly popular option. So I'm not entirely sure what the answer is, except I don't see it. I don't think it should be the sole preserve of a court. I think there has to be the interpretive obligation. The interpretive function of a court is terribly important, but it cannot be the sole arbiter of the way in which the Constitution is extended. There has to be some democratic or political control over that also, but also always recognizing the need for minority rights to be protected.
Thank you. Wendy.
Yeah, I concur with a lot of what Joanna's said there. I wonder whether the answer, as opposed to referenda, continued referenda, is a more deliberative democracy approach. I do think what France has done recently in relation to climate change and delivery of, you know, really presenting that issue for that citizens' convention to determine how to meet its climate change objectives with a commitment to you know, dependent on what was said, to either take to referenda or accept, is potentially a direction of travel that we should be looking at in order to ensure those kind of checks and balances. I think there's no doubt that there has been an expectation that the judiciary has become more politicised, not just in America, but clearly here in the UK as well, with the prorogation debate last year. And I suppose there is a bit for me, and maybe this is the ex-police officer in me, that kind of thinks that if there's a point where the judges need to get involved, potentially we've gone wrong somewhere in the first instance. But I wonder whether deliberative democracy approaches, and then really it does feel like a people's constitution, is a direction of travel for a written constitution.
Well, I think that's a very good point on which to finish, certainly for us as an organisation. So I'd really just like to thank our speakers, Wendy, Joanna, and of course Clive and Francis, for their contributions. We had, I'm afraid, far more questions than we could possibly put to our panel, but I hope everyone who's been watching would agree that we've had a very informative, I think, very engaged debate with a lot of common ground between our panelists, albeit some slight differences over the future of Scotland, inevitably. But I think it's been really key to what we as an organisation stand for. So thank you very much to our speakers. You're free now to depart while we just wrap up the rest of our business. So thank you both. And
thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for
Yeah.
everything that organisations like you are doing.
Absolutely, and thanks. I really enjoyed that, and it's great to see it's great to cross the party political divide and agree about so much. Thanks.
Absolutely. Take
Great.
care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. And so now I'd just like to conclude proceedings. So those of you who've been with us since this morning, so our members, thank you very much for staying on for this long. I'd just like to thank the staff at Unlock Democracy, who have worked very hard to make this event work technically and also from the point of view of content. And I'm sure you would agree with me that it's been successful from that point of view. Clearly, we've had many issues raised both in the earlier sessions around what we should be doing as an organisation, also constitutional matters that are our own constitution, but of course during this debate a written constitution and the implications of that, what it would look like, how it would be reached, and so on. I would just say that Unlocked Democracy has its work cut out. We've talked about many of the things that, many of the challenges that we face as a country around constitutional democracy rights issues. We've talked about the Electoral Commission. We've talked about perhaps secretive organisations that are working at the heart of government. We've talked about the commission that the government may or may not be proceeding with. The first part of which has been the threat to judicial review, but the commission that they've talked about is one that would look at the full range of democracy and rights issues and constitutional issues. But if you go and look at the remit, the possible remit of this commission, it does seem to be much more interested in shutting down rights, talking about changing the Human Rights Act, for instance, talking about is the balance of citizens' rights versus the powers of the security services to keep us safe, is it placed in the right place, which points to, I think, a reduction in our rights, not an improvement in them. One thing that we haven't talked about at all, which as an organisation Unlocked Democracy may want to look at in the future, is the whole question of disinformation. We saw, for instance, that in the US, Donald Trump has tried to really trash the whole of the US electoral system and leaving half of the population questioning whether the outcome of that vote was a valid one or not. But we've seen here in the UK, of course, quite a lot of talk about postal vote fraud and the need to introduce voter identification to reduce it. Well, there is a lot of talk about it, but actually in terms of evidence of postal voter fraud, evidence there is none. Yet we are going to be introducing potentially a system of voter identification, which we know will have as a direct consequence disenfranchising probably large numbers of young people, large numbers of people who move around a lot, and large numbers of people who are from perhaps BME communities who might not have easy access to the documentation that might have to be produced. So we shouldn't kid ourselves that some of the things that are happening in the US aren't things that equally could be happening here. And that's why we as an organisation, Unlocked Democracy, have exactly the same responsibility to campaign on these issues as we did as far back as 1988 when Charter 88 was set up. And I'm very pleased that we have not only new members, but of course members here on this call who I suspect were original signatories of that charter. And I can assure you that the fight for that is something that we will maintain. But I see in the chat that someone is referring to voting fraud having been now identified. Well, as far as I'm aware, I think in the last year there were no prosecutions for voter fraud. So if there is some, it's not exactly on a dramatic scale. And certainly what it will do is it will disenfranchise far more people than it would actually address in terms of reducing the very low incidence of postal vote fraud in the United Kingdom. So I think on that point, it's probably a good point to finish. But again, just to thank everyone who's joined us today. I hope you found this online method of doing things one that you'll be willing to experience again. And I think in future, we're likely to see more of our conferences, more of our AGMs held in this way, more speaker panel sessions held in this way, because I think on the whole, they tend to be much more accessible once people have got to grips with the technology than everyone trekking into a venue in central London. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you again to all staff members for making this happen, for council members and management board members for supporting us. And I look forward to working with our members in the next year on the campaigns that we've set out for you. So thank you very much.
Great.
And good night.